What if I told you that in 1887, in the heart of the Arizona Territory, a woman stood moments away from death, accused of witchcraft by her own people, a noose around her neck, and a bloodthirsty crowd baying for her execution? What if I told you that her salvation came from the most unexpected source imaginable? An Apache warrior who risked everything to save the life of a woman his people were supposed to consider their enemy. This isn't a fairy tale or a legend. This is a story based on real accounts from the American frontier, where fear and ignorance could condemn the innocent, and where sometimes the greatest acts of courage came from those we least expected. It's the extraordinary tale of Margaret Collins, a healer with Cherokee blood who used ancient plant medicine to save lives, only to be branded a witch by the very people she helped. But here's what makes this story truly remarkable. When Margaret's life hung by a thread, it was two eagles, a respected Apache warrior, who stepped forward, not for glory, not for revenge, but because he desperately needed what she could offer, the knowledge to save his dying daughter's life. What happened next would challenge everything both cultures believed about each other, and prove that sometimes the deepest magic isn't supernatural at all. It's the courage to reach across the divide that separates us. You're about to witness a story of unlikely alliances, cultural barriers broken down by desperate love, and the power of healing that transcends race, language, and generations of mistrust. This is the story of how an Apache warrior's act of mercy changed not just one woman's fate, but opened a bridge between two worlds that had known nothing but conflict. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Our story begins on a dusty afternoon in Cedar Ridge, Arizona, where a crowd had gathered to witness what they believed would be divine justice. Little did they know, they were about to witness something far more powerful, the beginning of an extraordinary human drama that would test the very limits of courage, compassion, and hope. Are you ready to step back in time to 1887? But before we dive into this incredible journey, if you love true stories of courage and unexpected heroes like this one, make sure to hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. It really helps us bring you more amazing historical tales like Margaret's. And don't forget to drop a comment below telling us what you think about this extraordinary story as it unfolds. Now, let's begin with the day Margaret Collins faced her accusers and discover how one woman's knowledge of healing plants became the catalyst for an incredible rescue that defied all expectations. The dust kicked up by angry boots created a swirling haze around the whitewashed wooden church that served as Cedar Ridge's courthouse. The late afternoon sun slanted through the grimy windows, casting long shadows across the packed interior, where 43 souls had gathered to witness what they believed would be divine justice. Margaret Collins stood in the center of the makeshift courtroom, her weathered hands bound behind her back with coarse hemp rope that had already begun to chafe her wrists raw. Her dark hair, streaked with premature gray from years of frontier hardship, hung loose around her shoulders after the constable had roughly removed the pins that morning. Facing her was a jury of 12 men, whose eyes burned with the peculiar mixture of fear and righteousness that had condemned countless innocents throughout history. The year was 1887, and the Arizona Territory settlement of Cedar Ridge had found its scapegoat for a summer of inexplicable misfortunes. Judge Cornelius Morrison, a portly man whose black robes hung awkwardly on his frame, adjusted his spectacles and cleared his throat. The makeshift bench he sat behind was nothing more than a communion table draped with a moth-eaten flag, but he wielded his authority like a sword. To his left sat the town's only ordained minister, Reverend Samuel Hayes, whose pale blue eyes held none of the compassion his calling should have demanded. "Thomas Bradley, step forward and state your accusations against the defendant," Morrison commanded, his voice echoing off the wooden walls decorated with crude paintings of biblical scenes. Bradley rose from the front pew, his massive frame trembling with barely contained rage. A cattle rancher, who had carved his claim from hostile territory through sheer stubbornness and back-breaking labor, he pointed an accusing finger at Margaret with the same hand that had buried his entire herd just 2 weeks prior. "She cursed my cattle," he bellowed, his weathered face flushed crimson above his graying beard. "Every last one of my 100 head died within 3 days after this. This witch came to my ranch with her devil's bag of strange herbs and unholy potions. My prize bull, worth more than most men make in 2 years, dropped dead right after she touched him with those cursed hands." Margaret's voice remained steady, despite the tremor that had begun in her bound hands, a reaction to both fear and the indignation that burned in her chest. "Mr. Bradley, I examined your cattle and told you the truth. The water source down by Willow Creek was contaminated with runoff from the old mine shaft. I warned you to move your herd to higher ground, to the spring near the mesa. I begged you to listen. Silence, witch!" Morrison slammed his gavel, a carpenter's hammer repurposed for judicial use, against the wooden table with such force that the sound cracked like a gunshot through the church. "You will speak only when addressed directly by this court." But Margaret continued, desperation creeping into her voice as she saw the faces of people she had helped, people who now stared at her with cold judgment. The arsenic deposits were leaching into the creek bed. Any cattleman with experience would have recognized the signs: the green foam on the water's surface, the way the grass yellowed along the banks. "I tried to help you save your livelihood." Bradley's face contorted with grief and rage. "My father built that ranch with his bare hands, fought off Apache raids and rustlers to keep it running. Now it's gone, all of it, because of your witchcraft." "The evidence against the defendant is overwhelming and damning," Morrison declared, opening a leather-bound ledger where the town's clerk had meticulously recorded each accusation. Livestock dying under mysterious circumstances, crops failing despite adequate rainfall, children falling ill with strange fevers and ailments, all occurring after this woman arrived in our God-fearing community 3 months ago with her ungodly practices and heathen remedies. The crowd murmured agreement, their voices rising like the buzz of angry wasps. Margaret had seen this kind of hysteria before during her travels from settlement to settlement across the harsh frontier, always staying one step ahead of suspicion and fear. She was a midwife and healer, trained by her Cherokee grandmother in the ancient ways of plant medicine and natural remedies. But to these frightened, desperate people, clinging to survival in an unforgiving land, her knowledge represented something dark and threatening. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, a thin woman whose hollow cheek spoke of years of frontier hardship, stood from her seat near the back of the church. "I've done nothing but help your families," Margaret said, her voice carrying across the packed room as she looked directly at the woman whose life she had saved. "Mrs. Patterson, I delivered your baby when no doctor would come during that blizzard in February. I sat with you for 18 hours while you labored. And when the cord was wrapped around little Samuel's neck, I saved both your lives." Patterson's face flushed with shame, but her husband's stern glare kept her seated and silent. The baby she now held, healthy, pink-cheeked Samuel, seemed to mock the accusations with his innocent presence. "And you, Judge Morrison," Margaret continued, turning her gaze to the man who held her life in his hands. "When your son Timothy was burning with fever last month, when his temperature was so high that he was seeing visions and speaking nonsense, I treated him with willow bark tea and cool compresses. I sat by his bedside for 3 days and nights straight, cooling his fever and making sure he took fluids. The fever broke naturally, as fevers do when properly tended, and your son lived." Morrison's jaw tightened, and Margaret could see the conflict warring in his eyes. The memory of his gratitude fighting against the pressure of his position and the expectations of the community he served. "And what price did you extract for that help?" Morrison asked, his voice quieter now, but no less dangerous. "What dark bargains did you make with the forces of evil? What did you demand in return for your services?" Margaret's shoulders sagged as the weight of their willful ignorance pressed down upon her. She had asked for nothing more than a hot meal and a place to sleep in their barn. She had saved Timothy Morrison's life with nothing more than knowledge passed down through generations of healers, with remedies as old as humanity itself. But fear had a way of twisting gratitude into suspicion, of transforming acts of mercy into evidence of malevolence. "I asked for nothing but the chance to help," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My Cherokee grandmother taught me that healing knowledge is a gift to be shared, not hoarded or sold. The earth provides medicine for all her children, Maggie," she used to say. "Some just forget how to listen." The mention of her Cherokee heritage sent a fresh wave of hostility through the crowd. Anti-Indian sentiment ran high in the territory, especially with news of renewed Apache raids filtering in from other settlements. To these people, Margaret's mixed blood was almost as damning as her supposed witchcraft. Reverend Hayes rose from his seat beside the judge, his black coat making him look like a carrion bird as he addressed the assembly. The defendant's own words condemn her. She admits to practicing the heathen rituals of savage peoples, to commune with forces that stand in opposition to Christian doctrine. The Bible is clear about such abominations. Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. The sentence is clear and righteous, Morrison declared, his voice carrying the weight of finality. Margaret Collins, you are found guilty of practicing witchcraft, of consorting with evil spirits, and of bringing calamity upon this Christian community. You will be hanged by the neck until dead at dawn tomorrow. May God have mercy on your soul. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause, but Margaret barely heard them above the roaring in her ears. She closed her eyes and tried to find some trace of her grandmother's presence, some echo of the wisdom that had guided her through so many years of wandering and healing. The memory came to her like a whisper. An old Cherokee woman with silver braids, teaching a young girl which plants could heal and which could harm, passing down knowledge that stretched back to the dawn of human civilization. As rough hands grabbed her arms and began dragging her toward the makeshift jail behind the church, Margaret caught sight of movement in the hills beyond town. The late afternoon light played tricks with shadows among the rocks and scrub brush, but her trained eye caught what others missed, the subtle signs of human presence where no settlers would venture. Apache scouts, their presence barely visible against the rocky terrain, watching the white settlement with the patience of predators. She had heard the rumors and reports filtering through the territory. Tensions between the settlers and the Apache were escalating rapidly, with both sides preparing for what seemed like inevitable and devastating conflict. Cattle raids had increased, and the army had been reinforcing their presence in the region. The Apache, driven from their traditional lands by an endless tide of settlers and miners, were making their desperation known through acts of defiance and warfare. The jail cell was nothing more than a converted storage room behind the church, with iron bars hastily installed over the single narrow window by the town's blacksmith. The floor was rough wooden planks, warped and splintered from years of housing grain sacks and church supplies. Margaret sat heavily on the crude straw mattress someone had thrown into the corner, her back against the cold stone wall that had been built to withstand both weather and attack. Through the barred window, she could see the construction of the gallows beginning in the town square. Men worked by lantern light, their hammers ringing against nails as they built the instrument of her death. The sight should have filled her with terror, but instead she felt a strange calm settling over her. Death, she realized, might be preferable to living in a world where ignorance and fear could triumph so completely over compassion and knowledge. Lord knows I tried, she whispered to herself, thinking of all the lives she had saved during her years of wandering the frontier. There was Maria Santos in Santa Fe, whose difficult breech birth would have killed both mother and child without Margaret's intervention. There was old Jake Murphy in Tombstone, whose infected leg wound would have meant amputation or death if she hadn't known how to draw out the poison with poultices made from desert plants. There were dozens of others, fever victims nursed back to health, women safely delivered of children, men and women healed of ailments that would have crippled or killed them. All of it meant nothing now. All of those lives saved, all of that suffering prevented, all of the knowledge she had accumulated and shared. It would die with her on the gallows at dawn. As night fell over Cedar Ridge, bringing with it the cool desert air that provided blessed relief from the day's heat, Margaret closed her eyes and tried to prepare her soul for whatever fate awaited her at sunrise. She had no way of knowing that in the hills above town, Apache eyes were watching with more than casual interest, and that her destiny was about to take an unexpected and extraordinary turn. The sound of hammering continued through the night as the townspeople prepared for what they believed would be righteous justice. But justice, Margaret had learned through hard experience, was often in short supply on the frontier, where fear and superstition could masquerade as righteousness, and where good intentions could be twisted into evidence of evil. In the darkness of her cell, listening to the steady rhythm of construction that would herald her death, Margaret Collins prepared to become another casualty of the collision between ignorance and wisdom, between fear and understanding in the unforgiving landscape of the American frontier. The pre-dawn air was crisp and still as Margaret was led from her cell toward the gallows. Her legs trembled, but she held her head high, refusing to give the gathered crowd the satisfaction of seeing her break. Judge Morrison read the charges one final time, his voice echoing off the surrounding buildings. "Any last words, witch?" he asked, his hand resting on the lever that would open the trapdoor. Margaret looked out at the faces of people she had tried to help. Mrs. Patterson, whose baby she had saved, young Timothy Morrison, whose fever she had broken, the Baker family, whose infected wounds she had cleaned and dressed. Their eyes held no gratitude now, only fear and righteous anger. "I forgive you all," she said simply. Morrison's hand moved toward the lever, but before he could pull it, the sharp whistle of arrows cut through the morning air. 3 Apache warriors emerged from behind buildings, where they had positioned themselves during the night, their movements swift and precise. The crowd scattered in panic as the warriors advanced. The lead warrior was tall and lean, with intelligent dark eyes and graying hair that spoke of wisdom earned through years of survival. This was Two Eagles, a respected member of his band, known for his strategic mind and unwavering honor. His companions flanked him as he approached the gallows with measured steps. "Cut her down," Two Eagles commanded in accented but clear English, his rifle trained on Judge Morrison. "This is none of your concern, Apache," Morrison sputtered, his face pale with fear. "This is white man's justice." Two Eagles' expression remained impassive. "Your justice would kill a healer. That is not justice. That is waste." Margaret stared at her unlikely rescuer, unable to comprehend why an Apache warrior would risk his life for a white woman. She had heard the stories of escalating conflicts between the Apache and settlers, the mutual distrust and violence that had defined their relationship. "Please," Morrison pleaded. "She's a witch. She brings nothing but death and disease." Two Eagles studied Margaret for a long moment, taking in her calm demeanor despite the noose around her neck, the way she had not begged or pleaded like many facing death would have. "I have watched this town," Two Eagles said. "I have seen her tend to your sick. Witches do not heal, they destroy. You destroy what you do not understand." With a swift movement, one of the other warriors cut the rope binding Margaret's hands, while Two Eagles kept his rifle trained on the crowd. Margaret rubbed her wrists, still processing her sudden reprieve from death. "Can you ride?" Two Eagles asked her directly. Margaret nodded, finding her voice. "Yes, but why are you helping me?" Two Eagles' eyes held depths of pain and desperate hope. "Because I need a healer, my daughter." His voice caught slightly. "She burns with fever. Our medicine man has tried everything. She is dying." The honesty in his voice struck Margaret deeply. Here was a father facing the loss of his child, willing to risk everything on the slim chance that the woman his people would consider an enemy might succeed where their own healer had failed. "I'll come with you," Margaret said without hesitation. As they prepared to leave, Judge Morrison found his courage. "You're making a mistake, Apache. That woman is cursed. She'll bring death to your people." Two Eagles turned back one final time, his voice carrying the weight of generations of conflict. "My people know the difference between healing and harm. Perhaps yours have forgotten." They rode hard into the hills, Margaret clinging to the horse Two Eagles had provided. As Cedar Ridge disappeared behind them, she realized she was riding toward an uncertain future with people she had been taught to fear, to save a child whose life might be the key to bridging two worlds that had known nothing but mistrust. The sun climbed higher as they made their way toward the Apache camp, and Margaret silently prayed that her grandmother's teachings would be enough to save not just one child's life, but perhaps something much larger. The Apache camp sat nestled in a protected canyon, invisible from the main trails that the cavalry and settlers used. As they approached, Margaret could see why Two Eagles' people had survived so long against overwhelming odds. Their positioning was strategic, with multiple escape routes and natural defensive barriers. The arrival of a white woman caused immediate tension. Warriors emerged from lodges with weapons ready, their faces hard with suspicion. Women pulled their children closer, whispering words Margaret couldn't understand, but whose meaning was clear. Danger had entered their sanctuary. "Bikair," an elderly warrior called out, using Two Eagles' Apache name. His voice carried authority. This was clearly someone of importance. "What madness is this? You bring the enemy into our home?" Two eagles dismounted and helped Margaret down from her horse. "She is a healer, uncle. Little Fox is dying, and our medicine has failed." The elderly warrior, whom Margaret realized must be a chief or elder, studied her with eyes that had seen decades of broken treaties and betrayed trust. "White healers brought disease to our people. They poison what they touch." "Not all of them," Two Eagles replied firmly. "I watched her in the white settlement. She saved their children, delivered their babies. They feared her for it." Margaret stood quietly, understanding that her life hung in the balance of this conversation. She could feel dozens of eyes upon her, measuring her, judging her worthiness. The weight of historical grievances pressed down on the camp like a physical force. "Where is your daughter?" Margaret asked Two Eagles softly. He led her toward a lodge where the sound of labored breathing could be heard even from outside. Margaret's healer instincts kicked in immediately. She had heard that particular rhythm of breathing before. It usually meant pneumonia or severe respiratory infection. Inside the lodge, a young Apache woman sat beside a small girl who couldn't have been more than 7 years old. The child's skin was flushed with fever, her breathing shallow and rapid. The woman, clearly the child's mother, looked up with a mixture of hope and hostility. "This is Dancing Rain, my wife," Two Eagles said, "and this is Little Fox, our daughter." Margaret knelt beside the child, her trained eye taking in the symptoms: high fever, rapid pulse, the telltale rattle in her breathing. "How long has she been like this?" 4 days, Dancing Rain answered in heavily accented English, her voice tight with worry. Margaret gently examined the child, feeling her forehead, listening to her breathing, checking her pulse. Little Fox's eyes fluttered open briefly, unfocused and glassy with fever. "It's pneumonia," Margaret said, looking up at the anxious parents. "The infection is in her lungs. Without treatment, she didn't need to finish the sentence. Dancing Rain's face crumpled with grief, but Two Eagles remained stoic, though Margaret could see the pain in his eyes. "Can you help her?" he asked simply. Margaret thought of her medicine bag, confiscated when she was arrested. She would have to improvise with what the Apache camp could provide. "I need certain plants, willow bark for the fever, pine needle tea for the lungs, and if you have any honey." "We have these things," Dancing Rain said quickly. "But will they be enough?" "I don't know," Margaret answered honestly. "But I'll do everything I can." As word spread through the camp that the white woman was treating Little Fox, people began to gather outside the lodge. Some came with curiosity, others with skepticism, and a few with open hostility. Margaret could feel the weight of their collective judgment as she worked. She prepared the willow bark tea first, cooling it carefully before trying to get the semi-conscious child to drink. Little Fox's breathing was becoming more labored, and Margaret knew they were racing against time. "In my village," she said to Dancing Rain as she worked, "I learned from my Cherokee grandmother. She taught me that plants are medicine for all people, not just some." Dancing Rain studied her with new interest. "You have Indian blood?" "1/4 Cherokee. My grandmother said healing knowledge belongs to everyone who will use it to help, not harm." As the night wore on, Margaret worked tirelessly, administering treatments, monitoring the child's breathing, adjusting remedies based on Little Fox's responses. Two Eagles and Dancing Rain took turns helping, following Margaret's instructions despite the cultural chasm between them. Outside, the camp waited, suspended between hope and fear, as a white healer fought to save an Apache child's life. Dawn was breaking over the canyon walls when Little Fox's fever finally began to break. Margaret had spent the entire night beside the child, monitoring her breathing, adjusting treatments, and praying to whatever spirits might be listening. The willow bark tea had brought down the fever, and the pine needle concoction seemed to be clearing her lungs. "Mama?" Little Fox's voice was weak but clear, the first coherent word she had spoken in days. Dancing Rain burst into tears, gathering her daughter into her arms while being careful not to disturb Margaret's treatments. Two Eagles placed a gentle hand on his wife's shoulder, his own eyes bright with unshed tears. "The fever has broken," Margaret said, exhaustion evident in her voice. "She's not out of danger yet, but this is very good." Word of the child's improvement spread quickly through the camp. The hostile whispers were replaced by cautious hope, and Margaret noticed that the warriors who had been guarding the lodge entrance had relaxed their stance. As Little Fox grew stronger throughout the day, able to sit up and take some broth, Margaret found herself in an extraordinary position. She was no longer just a prisoner or refugee. She had become something else entirely. The Apache people began to approach her with their own ailments: an infected cut, a persistent cough, a difficult pregnancy. "You have given me back my daughter," Two Eagles said as they sat outside the lodge that evening, watching Little Fox play weakly with other children who had been forbidden to come near her during her illness. "Any healer would have done the same," Margaret replied. Two Eagles shook his head. "Number you risked your life to save someone you had never met, from people you were taught to fear. That is not just healing, that is courage." Margaret thought about his words. "Why did you save me from the gallows? You could have been killed." "Because I watched you in that town," Two Eagles answered. "I saw how you cared for their sick, even knowing they would turn on you. I saw a healer, not an enemy." Dancing Rain approached them, carrying a beautifully crafted medicine bag. "This belonged to my grandmother," she said, offering it to Margaret. "She was a great healer among our people. I think she would want you to have it." Margaret was deeply moved by the gesture. "I can't accept this. It's too precious." "You saved my child," Dancing Rain said firmly. "You are a healer, and healers need their medicine. Take it." As Margaret accepted the gift, she realized that something profound had shifted. The invisible walls between their peoples hadn't disappeared, but they had developed cracks through which understanding could pass. "What will you do now?" Two Eagles asked. "You cannot return to that town." Margaret looked around the camp, at the people who had welcomed her, despite generations of conflict. "I don't know. I suppose I'll find another settlement, try again." "Or," Two Eagles said carefully, "you could stay here. Our people need a healer, and you have proven yourself." The offer hung in the air between them. Margaret knew that staying would mean crossing a line that few white people had ever crossed. She would be choosing to live among people her own race considered enemies, to build a life in a world completely different from the one she had known. "The soldiers will come looking for me eventually," Margaret said practically. "They'll want to know what happened to me." "Let them come," Two Eagles replied. "We have survived soldiers before." As the sun set over the canyon, painting the rocks in shades of gold and red, Margaret made her decision. She would stay, at least for now. She would continue to heal whoever needed healing, regardless of the color of their skin or the language they spoke. Little Fox ran up to her, still weak but smiling brightly. "Thank you for making me better," she said in English, the words carefully pronounced. Margaret knelt down to the child's level. "Thank you for letting me help you." Later that night, as the camp settled into peaceful sleep, Margaret sat by the dying fire and thought about the strange turns her life had taken. She had been condemned as a witch by her own people, rescued by those she was supposed to fear, and had found a new family among the Apache. Her grandmother had been right. Healing knowledge belonged to everyone willing to use it with compassion. And sometimes, Margaret realized, the greatest magic wasn't in the plants or remedies, but in the courage to reach across the divides that fear had created. In the distance, a coyote howled, and the sound seemed to carry her grandmother's voice on the wind. "Well done, child. Well done." The end.